All right, so after looking at the information about Mount Rainier, remember we can see that it was very active about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. More recently, it looks like the last time it erupted was about 250 years ago. So, looking at this, it's really hard to see a pattern. For a while it was very active, and then now it's been about, every 500 to, about 700 years. But it's hard to say if that pattern is going to really continue. So if I was answering this question, is there a pattern of eruptions from Mount Rainier? If so, how would you describe the pattern? Well, a sentence frame, you might say something like, Mount Rainier doesn't exhibit a clear pattern because. So, you could argue that another way. When I look at it, it seems like it's really changing from erupting very often to maybe every 400 to 500 years, but we don't really know if that's going to continue. So it's hard to say. I want you to record what your thoughts are for that one. The next question, compare the pattern of eruptions of Mount St. Helens to the eruptions of Mount Rainier. Well, we've already looked at Mount Rainier, and here's Mount Rainier again, and then Mount St. Helens is actually right underneath it. So if we look at this, it looks like Mount St. Helens kind of erupts in kind of groups or patterns. So it looks like it's erupted very recently within the last couple years, and it seems like within the last 500 years, it's probably erupted about every 25 years or so. And then we can see that pattern kind of continues for a while. So in general, we can definitely say that Mount St. Helens erupts more frequently and more often than Mount Rainier. And judging based on how many times it's erupted recently and just in the past few years, we can probably expect that to continue to do the same thing. So you might start out by saying something like Mount St. Helens eruptions are different from Mount Rainier's eruptions because. And so you could give some evidence to show how they're different, or also if anything is actually similar. Okay, next question. Which volcanoes have had a period of 1,000 years without a eruption? Did any of these volcanoes erupt again after 1,000 years? So we're trying to look at the data here, and we're trying to find any volcanoes that were dormant for over 1,000 years. So remember, when we look at our graph, 1,000 years is basically 2 boxes on our graph. So if we look at each volcano, and if we can see anywhere on our graph where there's 2 empty boxes, that's telling us that that's at least 1,000 years. So if we look at Lassen Peak, this one hasn't erupted for 1,000 years. Actually, from about 4,000 years ago to about 2,500 years ago, it didn't erupt. Mount Shasta, doesn't look like I can really find any on that one. Looks like Medicine Lake Volcano, there's a big gap in eruptions there. Crater Lake doesn't look like it's erupted anytime recently at all. The Newberry Volcano, we have one there, one here. Here's a Three Sisters one. Mount Jefferson, looks like we haven't had any eruptions in the past 4,000 years. Mount Hood, we've had a big period of inactivity through here. So you're just looking at this and you're recording the name of the different volcanoes that haven't erupted for a period of 1,000 years. And then it says, did any of these volcanoes erupt again after 1,000 years? Well, we have this one right here, Lassen Peak, and then it erupted after that 1,000 years. And again, this one. So it looks like most of them that were inactive for over 1,000 years at some point started erupting again right here as well. Number 5. The last time Mount Rainier had a significant eruption was approximately 1,000 years ago. Analyze and interpret the data on the past eruptions of Mount Rainier to forecast whether Mount Rainier will erupt catastrophically again. Explain your answer based on the data in the pictograph. So this really goes back to the quest of our investigation, and we're investigating whether or not it would be safe to camp at Mount Rainier and to go on a hiking trip for a 2-week time period. And so they want us to look at the history of Mount Rainier within the last 1,000 years and to use that to kind of forecast what we would think might happen again. So let's go back and look at Mount Rainier. And so Mount Rainier, the last 1,000 years would be from here to here. And this is the 2 eruptions that we had at Mount Rainier. And so it looks like Mount Rainier erupted about 1,000 years ago based on the ash that we found in the rock record. And then also it looks like probably maybe about 300 years ago or so it erupted. And if we look at just that pattern between this eruption and the last one, so this is about 1,000 years ago, this is probably about 200 years ago, so we have about a difference of 800 years. So that means if the last one was 200 years ago, and if the pattern were to follow, we really shouldn't have a major eruption on Mount Rainier for another 400 or 500 years. So that's one piece of evidence I want you to think about. But what if this pattern doesn't hold and we go back to something like this, where Mount Rainier was erupting every 20 years or so? And so we don't really know. Okay, so I want you to think about that as you're answering the question. Number 6, how does your answer to the previous question affect your thinking that hiking around Mount Rainier is safe? Well, again, it comes back to the data we're looking at and how likely it is that Mount Rainier might erupt in a 2-week time period. So I want you to think about that. Last question. What other questions would you want to ask before making a final decision about whether hiking around Mount Rainier is safe? Well, so far all we've looked at is volcanic data. There's going to be more things we're going to be learning about, such as how the tectonic plates are moving off the west coast of the United States. So maybe you would want to look at how much those plates are moving. Maybe we'd want to monitor earthquakes. The movement of the earth might have something to do with a volcanic eruption. We might want to look at measuring any sorts of gas concentrations in the atmosphere, like do we have more carbon dioxide or sulfur dioxide or anything like that. We might want to measure the height of the landscape to see if it's bulging, which might be an indication that there's magma pushing up below the earth. So those are some other things that we're going to be talking about. We're just not that far yet. But so what we're doing with this activity is to try to look at some real data and relate where the volcano is along the plate boundary in the western United States, and relate that to the data of past volcanic eruptions to get a better idea of how likely Mount Rainier is to erupt anytime soon. So I think this is going to be a valuable activity that will have data to add to our quest that we're working on. So take your time on this, really look at the data, think critically about it, and if you have questions, send your science teacher a message. Have a good day.